Hello and welcome, everybody. It's an interesting time to talk about the Microsoft Datacenter Region in Austria at lunchtime. I hope I do not interfere with your biological rhythm, but I think it's a great topic, an important topic, and I hope I can give you some clues on what does it mean in real life and how can you benefit from the data center region that we get locally. My name is Vater. My role is the lead data center cloud solution architect for the Austrian Datacenter. So yeah, I never thought that this would happen, that we really, many years ago, I never thought that this would happen, that we really get a region in Austria. But yeah, you never know what life brings. And so we are here. We announced it in October. And hopefully we will have it at the second half of next year so that we can deploy resources. First of all, when we talk about a Microsoft data center, and especially for the Austrian region, it's not only an Azure data center. So yes, we will start with Azure, with the services, but 3 to 6 months later, we will get Microsoft 365 services, and 3 to 6 months later, we will also get Dynamics services. So don't just treat it as an Azure data center, also the other clouds will be there. And what do we get? Maybe you know, we have our Microsoft global network. Yeah? That's a really interesting fact that many people don't know, that Microsoft, in the meantime, is one of the largest network providers in the world. Why? Yes, we need it because we have to connect our data centers. And there are also fun facts combined with it, that we lay big cables through the oceans and so on to connect our data centers. And I also have, we can talk at the end about the, let's say, fun facts or things you didn't know about the Microsoft data centers. And there I also have a picture of the big ships that do the cabling and so on. But what is important for us is, you know, we have different clouds, and also for Azure, for example, we have the public Azure cloud, we have the government clouds, we have sovereign clouds, for example, in China. And what we will get in Austria is we will be part of this large ecosystem and network with a public Azure data center region. And what does it mean? Yes, we are here on the map. We see Austria East. This will be the name of the data center region. And we will be included in the whole system of Azure. What does that mean? Everything you know today from Azure, from its foundation, from its resiliency, we will also get it for the Austrian region. So it starts with the design, yeah. And through the years, we had various data center generations, because Microsoft started building data centers 32 years ago. And it's obvious that during this time, a lot of innovation also brought new things, new methods, new processes, and so on. And we will also talk a little bit about, let's say, the evolution of the data centers, also from an energy point of view and so on, and also from a high availability standpoint. Because what is very important is that we do not just get one data center and we have any kind of catastrophic, whatever, environmental flood or something, that the whole data center is down. This is why we also introduced a concept called availability zones. And we will talk about that also in a minute. What you get is also the whole operations process that we use to run Azure which is pretty enormous, as you can imagine, because when we take the regions and then the data centers, we count around, let's say, 200 data centers. They're with millions of servers, and we have to use lots and lots of automation to do this in an efficient way to run the data center. And also a lot of machine learning and AI-driven processes are in place in the meantime to run our data centers safely. And of course, the global team that runs our data centers, it's a special team. I, as a Microsoft employee, I'm treated the same as an external person when it comes to the data centers. It's a special team. It's the operations team of our data centers. They have to run through rigorous security checks and so on. And we will also come to how we operate data centers in some minutes, because we also have pretty rigorous processes there, also from a security point of view and so on. But what does a data center look like, and how will it look like in Austria? Maybe you know the pictures. This was the first data center in Dublin that we built outside of the US in 2009. I just want to give you some pictures so that you get an impression on, what's the cloud in reality. And I want to give you also a little bit of a glimpse on how the expansion looks like and how we deal with the demand that came in the last years. So we see here, we had Dublin 3 to 5, which is now the small one in the back. Then came Dublin 6, Dublin 7, Dublin 8, and we also already have a lot of land for the future workloads that will land in Dublin, for example. Another example is a data center in the US. In 2014, it looked like that. And what you also see here, as I spoke about different generations of data centers, you see different types of data centers here. And this is what I mean with generations. We went from the traditional, let's say, we have a big concrete hall and put server racks in there, to something where we just connected containers, to something where we do it in a more modular way. And what you see here is a good example of different data center generations. And when we take a look at the same data center 3 years later, in 2017, it looks like that. So the expansion is pretty enormous. And as a next example, I have Quincy in Washington here. And you see it gets more and more modern from a generation point of view. And this is maybe the home to your services that you already use. So this is one of the data centers in Amsterdam. As I said, we are talking about availability zones and so on. So it's not just one location where we have data centers. They are distributed across various locations around Amsterdam and also in the other cities. And as an example, for here Singapore, it looks pretty different, right? We have, let's say, a criteria checklist of around 32 check boxes that we have to check before we build a data center somewhere. And of course, we have to adapt to the environment that is in a specific location. In Singapore, for example, there is not so much land. And if there is land, it's pretty expensive. So we had to build it in a vertical way. So we have a 13-story building that is now hosting the services in Singapore, for example. When we take a look inside, I think that looks pretty familiar for most of us. It's, let's say, a traditional way of how data centers look like. But Of course, you can imagine we have lots of these server rows in our data center. And what does it look like in Austria? So I will show you the first blueprint that we built. Of course, it's a joke, but it pretty much sums up what is really important for us. We need a modular design. We want to be carbon neutral. We need renewable energy at the location. We need a good, let's say, connection to all the network providers. And of course, we have to make sure that we can apply our security that we need to run our data centers. So what does it mean? When we take a look at the physical infrastructure that we will get, I spoke about 3 availability zones. What does it mean? An availability zone is translated a separate data center. So we would have 3 separate data centers. They have complete independent power, cooling, and networking. And they are connected with a latency round-trip time of lower than 2 milliseconds. That is what makes up a data center region. And of course, there are scenarios where we have paired regions, for example, like Amsterdam or Dublin. We will not have this kind of paired data center in the next year. We will have one region and with 3 availability zones, and these availability zones are completely independent from each other. So when you take, let's say, an average customer who runs his own 2 data centers today, maybe in the geographical area of Vienna, he already gains a 3rd data center if he moves his services to Azure, because we then have the same latency as he has it right now, but with 3 data centers that are connected together to build a single region. I will also take a look at the comment section. So if you have any questions during the talk, please just put them in the comments, and I will always try to see if there is anything that we can talk about immediately or to talk about it at the end. So please just use the comment section if you want. And translated to the Austrian map, it will look like that. We will have 3 data centers, let's say 1 in the north, 1 in the south, and 1 in the east of Austria, of Vienna. And this is what we will get in the time frame, let's say, second half of next year. And why do we do it? And how can you benefit from it? There were 2 main factors that more or less were blockers of cloud projects in the past, locally here in Austria, because the next data center was, for example, in Amsterdam or in Dublin or Frankfurt. One of the main drivers why we build a data center is that we now can do, or you can do, in-country customer data storage. So if you have any regulations that mandate you have to store your data locally in Austria, if you have any internal policies that say the same thing, you can now do it with Azure because we have the local data center. And if you, as you know, you decide where you put your data. In Azure, I think 95% of the services in Azure are built so that you can decide where to put the data, and they stay there unless you do something else or copy it somewhere else. So this was the first main point that will now, let's say, bring new projects to life. And the second one is the latency topic. The latency topic is one which is pretty hard to tackle because also Microsoft is not able to speed up the speed of light. And if Amsterdam is, let's say, some 100 kilometers away, we have some latency between, in the best case, we have around 15 to 20 milliseconds if you use ExpressRoute in Azure or something like that. But when we take a look at some, let's say, legacy applications where there is a high sensitivity from the let's say the web part to get an answer from the database or something like that, these were all things where we had to either find workarounds and put also the web and the database layer to Azure so that they again sit beneath each other, or they remained on premises for the moment. But now with this low latency, we have the possibility to tackle this problem. And if you put it in an Azure data center, it will behave like you would have put it in your own data center that you run today. So there are two questions I see from Thomas Fischl. Is the network data automatically encrypted if it goes between ACs? Yes, it is. As I mentioned, these network connections, also if they are not through the public internet or something, these are our own lines that exist here between the data centers, but it's also encrypted, yes. And the second question, if workloads are spun up in the Austrian availability zone, the data will not leave the borders and will stay here. Yes, as I mentioned, for, let's say, 95% of the services, when we talk about Azure, that's absolutely true. So if you spin up a virtual machine and have your data on the disk of the virtual machine, this disk will remain in Austria, unless you say, okay, I want to replicate this to Amsterdam or to whatever, Australia or something else. But there is no automatic process that would move your data. There are some services, but it's always service specific, where we, for example, let's take Windows Virtual Desktop. Here the metadata is, for example, held in the US, but just the metadata, not the virtual desktops that you run. So the disk with the virtual desktop, it's will be in Austria. The metadata is just on, okay, which machines are available, how should I route the traffic, but that's also a point in time scenario. It exists today, and as you know, Azure is more or less, or the Microsoft Cloud as a whole is more or less some kind of evolutional organism. So what we don't have today, it's possible that we have it tomorrow. And as the services are, let's say, expanded and fine-tuned over time, there will also be the possibility that these small set of services that you can see on the website where the data is stored and so on, will also be locally available. But at the moment, I think there are 5% of the services where you would have some kind of automatic transfer of data. But as mentioned, that's not your customer data. That's not your VM. That's not the contents of your database that you run there. That's not the application that you run as an app service or something like that. So for nearly all of the services, that's true. It stays in Austria and it's there. Okay, so I see no more questions at the moment. So let's come to a very, very special topic, because this is something that Microsoft takes very seriously. It's all about sustainability. You saw the pictures of the data centers, and as you see, these are really, really big infrastructures. And as you can imagine, sustainability is on one hand something that Microsoft wants to do out of its own efforts. But on the other side, of course, sustainability also comes with effectiveness, because running such data centers, there are really small things that can change a lot, also in the costs of running a data center and so on. And this is why also, maybe you know these three persons, our executives gave, let's say, our commitment to the sustainability topic. And when we talk about the data centers, the most important one actually is this 2025 timeframe. There we will be 100% on renewable energy for running all our data centers. Actually, we are around 70%. So all the data centers will be powered by wind, solar, and so on. And you maybe also heard the announcements that by 2030, we want to become carbon negative and also then suck all the CO2 out of the atmosphere that Microsoft produced since its beginning. So we are really investing heavily here in projects to remove CO2 from the environment and so on. So this is a really serious topic. And when we again come back to the data centers, yes, it's possible to run your services from a energy consumption point of view up to 93% more efficient than you maybe do it in your own data center. We will come to the why. I will show you why this is, because the main point here is a number that's called power usage effectiveness. And this power usage effectiveness is something where when you think of a data center and you want to run a server in there, the server, let's say, needs 100 watt, and it's a small one. You cannot buy 100 watt from an energy provider and then have it directly on the server, because what this power usage effectiveness tells you is how much overhead you have and how much cost you pay for nothing just to bring this 100 watts to your server, because you have your cooling, you have your building, you have the lights in the building, you have maybe some backup generators and so on, the switches, everything in the way up to the server, let's say, wastes energy, and with the energy wastes also costs on your side. And a normal, let's say, a traditional data center, when we started, let's say this 32 years ago, we started with a PUE of 2.5 to 2.0, and that's also something that we see nowadays in traditional data centers, that they operate somewhere between 1.8 and 2.0. So you could easily say that you are wasting double of your needed energy because you have to buy 200 watts of energy to bring 100 watt to your server. This would be a PUE of 2.0. And yes, we just, let's say, waste 18.9% of energy on the way. And that's something that's really important for us, not just from an environmental point of view, but of course also from an economical point of view, because you can imagine that we really need lots of power. And for example, here are just two things to mention. We have a 350 megawatt new solar power in Virginia. We have 180 megawatts of wind power in the Netherlands, and so on. I take a look at the questions. Yes, they will be answered for the services, also ExpressRoute. Yeah, we can do this. I have an extra slide on which services will be available. And what we also get, here you see this evolution from this PoE perspective, one of the most interesting things compared to, let's say, a traditional data center is, for example, the cooling topic. We have no chillers in our data center. What we use is adiabatic cooling. What does that mean? We have large air handling units, either on top of a data center or besides the data center. And these air handling units just take the outside air, filter it, compress it, and let it fall down on the data center rooms. And this is why we introduced something like, we call it a hot temperature DC. We do not run the data center anymore with, let's say, 15 degrees Celsius. And if you are a little bit longer in the IT, you maybe are used to it, to sit in the old days beneath a server, put your CDs in there and get a cold on the next day because of these low temperatures. What we run is a data center, it's called hot temperature data center, and we just use the outside air. What if the outside air is above 29 degrees, because that's more or less the threshold? What then kicks in is something that's called evaporation cooling. And I think this is a principle from the old Romans or Greeks, where you have curtains, and these curtains have water running down, and you can also use it at for yourself in the summer if you do it with your door or something like that. And what this brings us is a drop of 6 degrees in the temperature. And for me, that's pretty impressive that we use such, let's say, old technologies also for our big data centers here. And of course, when we talk about the environmental topics, our servers are commodity hardware, but they are optimized on one side for the cloud, but also for the environmental effects. Because when we think about a motherboard, we have also, you can see how our motherboards look like, because we have this project Olympus in the Open Compute project, where we contribute to the community on how we design our motherboards, for example, because there is nothing on it that is not really necessary, because every useless part on our motherboards maybe uses heat or generates heat or wastes energy. For example, no VGA adapter. A VGA adapter is useless for us in a data center, and it consumes around 5 watt. If you multiply it with 1 million servers, it's also an economical point of view. But the most important thing is we also think about the time after it's decommissioned. So the hardware, when we decommission it, there are no hazardous materials. So, for example, no lead on the motherboard. And this is all really important also for running our data centers. So, again, what's one point additionally here to the economical fact, we also have a very high efficient water usage. So we have something that's called a water loop. So we do not take fresh water out of the system. We reuse or repurpose the water and so on. But what other benefits are there for customers and partners? Of course, we as Microsoft think that the local data centers will also create additional revenue streams also on partners and customer side. And job creation, because it's not only about the data center. And maybe you saw the session in the morning. There is also, let's say, a learning initiative where Microsoft commits to train 120,000 people in Austria for digital skills and so on. And for us, it's also important to foster this local digital resiliency, because in times like this, as you know, last year, nowadays it's really important to have, let's say, alternatives to the local data center, but they also have to comply with your, let's say, policies or regulations, for example, because of data storage. And this is why you now have an alternative for running your services also in the local area. And now to the question of which services will be available in the Austrian data center. There is a link at the bottom of this slide, and if you use this link afterwards, you are directed to a public Azure website. I will shortly do it here. So what you see here are these different services and what these services mean. Yeah. So to the categories, we have a differentiation between global services and regional services. The global services, like for example, Azure Active Directory, Azure Resource Manager, and so on, we will get them if we want them or not, because they are necessary to run the platform itself. The regional services, that depends on market demand and so on. And these regional services are now grouped into three categories: foundational, mainstream, and specialized. Foundational, we will get 100%. Mainstream, we will get 90+%. And for the specialized services, which is a smaller number, fortunately, than mainstream and foundational, there we have to provide, let's say, we have to show the Microsoft Corporation that there is a demand for these services, because these services also cost us at Microsoft a lot of money to provide them in a specific area. And that's why, yeah, the business case has to look good. And that's more or less my responsibility in the next months, to find customers, partners, projects who want to deploy their services in Austria. And then we have to identify, are there any specialized services that this solution would need? And if yes, then they will, let's say, be put in a queue. Yeah? And then we have to sum up at some point and see how many demand for which service is there. And then Corp will decide if we will get this service from day one of opening the data center, or maybe later, or maybe never. Yeah? So that's the process on how this works. But you can be assured the foundational services and mainstream services are, there is all in it that you maybe know, all the virtual networking, the app services, the databases, the managed databases, and so on. Example of specialized hardware, for example, is let's say the really big SAP machines. We will have the AMs, but the MV2 there we would have to show the demand. Machines with GPUs in it, Azure NetApp Files, for example. Azure NetApp Files is something where NetApp really puts their racks into our data centers, but it has to make sense from an economical point of view for us and for NetApp and so on. So this is why we have to calculate a business case there. And yeah, more or less, this is how it works. So if you take a look at the link and you have a vision of a project, just go through the list and see if there is any specialized service that you would need. And you then can also reach out to me, and we can have a talk and see if maybe there are alternatives, yeah, so that you use some modules from Amsterdam and some modules from Austria, or if it's a need because of data residency topics or something like that, then you can also be in the list and that we present to Corp, and you can at this point actively influence how our data centers will look like when they will be opened. All right, let's go through the other topics. Is there a schedule? Which services? Yeah, again, to the schedule, let's say roughly second half of next year will be the opening. So 2022, next year. And as I mentioned, Azure will start, and let's say 3 months later, we will have Office 365, Microsoft 365 services, and then 3 to 6 months later, Dynamic services. So that's the schedule. And as mentioned, foundational and mainstream, let's take it at 100%. And specialized, yeah, we will have to show the demand that the Austrian market needs these specialized services. And then the question, will there be a new express route location in Austria as well? Yes. As you know it from other, let's say, regions in Azure, there will also be a peering location here in Austria. Do we get all instance types in the Austrian region or only a limited set? Yes, there will be a limited set, but as mentioned, if you really need them, we can influence it. And if we find other customers who also need it, or you need 100,000 CPUs, then we would also do it. But it depends on the, let's say, on the instance type. And but let's say general compute, yes, we will get it. For example, the GPU machines, we won't get it in the first phase, but if we show the demand, then we would have the possibility to influence the makeup of the data center. All right, so these were the questions at the moment. If we now take a look at also another important topic, compliancy. So the Austrian Datacenter will, of course, also join all the certifications that you maybe already know from the other Azure regions. If there is also a specific Austrian certification by then, we will see. There are, let's say, a lot of initiatives according to certifications on one side and also on our side, which one we would try to achieve and so on. But this can help you also with your audits, because if you run something on Azure, you can save time by just saying, okay, my service is running on Azure. Here is the certificate for whatever certification you need. And you maybe can reduce the effort. Maybe just you then have just to do the work for your application part, but not for the platform part, for example. And of course, the Austrian Data Center will also be part of our operations center, also the cyber defense center, and so on. And it will be completely included in the whole ecosystem of Azure. There is another question. Do you know what are the supported ISP express route providers? Actually, this is work in progress, so we don't have the complete list by now. I know there are a lot of talks and negotiations and so on, and this will be something that will come up with information sometime before we open the data center. But that's work in progress. Who will be the tier 1 providers? All right. Let's take just a small look at the security. Also, the Austrian Data Center will have these extensive layers of protection. So it will not be possible to, let's say, to just walk in the data center and take a look. Yeah, of course, that's obvious. There will be a lot of security precautions from fencing and all these detectors, metal detectors, if you would be allowed in the data center. So if the data center personnel has to, let's say, easy example, change a hard disk somewhere, this has to run through a process. The process looks like this, that this person would have to request access for a specific room, for a specific time, for a specific task. This runs through a workflow that has to be allowed. And if this is allowed, then he will have this limited time-bound access right on his badge. But nonetheless, he has to go through metal detectors. It's traced how long he needs until he gets to the room. And if this is too long, then there is an alarm raised. And so there are really rigorous processes also internally for the data center stuff. And our data center will also have all these. And one important topic, this was more or less the point of view from a person that works in the data center. And the person that works in the data center will never have any access to the, let's say, the software layer of Azure. So there is a clear separation of duties that you do not know both parts. So if we now take a look on how Microsoft is protecting Microsoft, first of all, of course, there is, as I mentioned, this specific hardware that's built for the cloud with a blueprint that's open source. But of course, it's hardened. There is a lot of, let's say, knowledge and intelligence went into all these automated processes. We use a lot of our own technologies like digital twins and simulations of our networking and so on. So before we enter a new route into the routing table, there is, let's say, a virtualized network like a digital twin. And we try it there and test it out before it goes into phase one, where we just have a small segment and so on. And there are really rigorous processes that work in, let's say, behind the curtain here in Azure. One very important thing is also, or interesting thing, is also our red team and blue team operations. So we really have, let's call it hackers inside of Microsoft. We have a red team and a blue team. The red team has nothing else to do than to break into the platform, and the blue team has the duty to detect it or prevent it. And every 90 days, the teams change, and an attacker becomes a defender and vice versa. So we try also to make the evolution of our internal processes and all the security guardrails by ourselves and not by just reacting on something that happens from the outside world. And as mentioned, all the operations also in the Austrian data center will always be done with least privileged access and just-in-time access. So no standing access at all for anyone, also in the infrastructure, but also on the software layer. And of course, each service that will be deployed in Azure and also in the Austrian region will follow our security development lifecycle. And then there is a lot of, as mentioned, monitoring and machine learning, artificial intelligence running in the background, because as a number, there are around 92 million signals in a minute that we have to analyze. So if this is a possible attacker or malicious action or whatever, and that's a number. You can't do it on your own in a GUI. So we need to make sure that we really have pretty rigorous and exhaustive processes running automatically here. And of course, you can, again, also in the Austrian data center, put your own security controls on top. We do a lot in the platform, but it does not prevent you from putting your own firewalls there, your own monitoring solution, whatever you need based on your policies or the requirements of some regulations or whatever. Yeah, so we have 5 minutes left, and that's great because I just want to show you some fun facts according Azure as a global. That's the ship that we use to drop this big cable into the ocean. And what we did with that was creating a connection from Bilbao to Virginia with 160 terabits. That's something that I would like to have at my home. These are, from my point of view, really facts that not everyone would know that Microsoft does this. And also, it's pretty amazing what we do here with our project NETIC, which is this data center that we put underwater. This was just an experiment where we put this data center with 860 servers in it underwater and let it there for 2 years at the shore of Scotland. And this is what we do with research. We try to find new ways of building data centers in maybe a more efficient way, or to reach, let's say, areas where you don't have this great infrastructure at land. So we could put it, let's say, at sea. And also here, a lot of economical facts or sustainability facts. It's powered by wind turbine on land, but it has built in a tidal turbine so that we use the tide to produce energy. It's isolated like a submarine so that all the electrical signals inside do not interfere with the marine life outside and so on. But I think it's pretty amazing what we are doing here. And also some other research projects, like, for example, the liquid cooling that we are testing with. If you take a look at this lower left video, when you see this motherboard in water, it looks like water. It's pretty scary, right? And but that's something that we try to research if we can come up with a better cooling solution, and that doesn't need that much of energy. And also on the storage side, we have a project called Silica where we try to store data in glass. And we also have another project where we store data in holograms, because the holograms can be deleted again. With storage on glass, you would have to melt it down and then you have glass again and do the same again. But you can't delete it in this way. And one pretty interesting one is also this project Pelix, where we store data in DNA. And because of the density that this DNA has, we would be able to store 1 zettabyte of data. Zettabyte. So we would just, for the whole internet and so on, we would just need, let's say, a double-digit number of racks to store everything that's outside in our world on just a bunch of racks with DNA storage. And this type of small DNA, which is comparable to this pen, would have, for example, a volume of 10 terabytes. And that's really, really amazing. And also one fun fact that I would like to close with is, what servers do we internally have? And I just want to show you the evolution, because some years ago, we introduced a machine with 500 gigabytes, and it was so big that we called it Godzilla. And some years after that, we had to create we used a new virtual machine or physical machine that you can then use as a virtual machine with 4 terabytes of RAM. And we called it Beast because, at that time it was a beast. Sometime later, and this is what you now know as, for example, the MV2 machines for SAP, we had these 12 terabytes machines, and we called it Beast V2. And what you will get now is an even bigger machine, and we did not know which name to use, so we called it the Mega Godzilla Beast. And this is just to showcase also the evolution that's going on an infrastructure side. And this is what I would like to end my talk. As there are no more questions in the chat, I would like to thank you for your time. I hope you found it interesting, and if you have any questions, I will be on Discord, and just use the Azure AT channel to raise your questions, and I will answer them afterwards. So thank you for your time. Stay safe. Goodbye.